Hey everybody, this is my thoughts on Atomfall. This is a recent game by Rebellion Developments, the development studio that does the Sniper Elite games. And right off the bat, I have to start criticizing this thing rather than just talking about what it is, because one of the biggest problems that it has, and one of the biggest problems it's had with finding any kind of real audience, is that pretty much everybody who looks at this game has a hard time figuring out exactly what it's trying to be. Because it's billed as a survival game, but there is no actual survival element to it. It's not like you have to have food and water, you don't need to take shelter from weather or anything like that. It just has a crafting system, kind of like you would expect from these open-world survival craft games where you're able to craft things like bandages and such. They also bill it as an action game, and it is a bit closer to the mark in that regard because there is at least some emphasis on the combat in this game, consisting of melee and ranged combat. But something you find out pretty quickly is that combat is actually de-emphasized in the game, because until you get fairly far into the game, ammunition is rather hard to come by, so you're not going to be using most of the guns in this game until you've managed to stockpile enough ammo to feel comfortable using them. And it'll be a bit before you have access to the likes of the bow and arrows, where you can actually retrieve your arrows after shooting them at enemies and the environment and such, thus maintaining your ammunition supply. But then you look at the actual melee combat, and it consists of kicking enemies away from you, doing basically no damage to them, but obviously staggering them, and bonking them with various melee weapons, either using light or heavy attacks, or by throwing your weapon at enemies, which is usually a pretty stupid idea unless you have more of them in your inventory. And that's pretty much it. No special moves or combos or anything of the sort, just bonk the enemy with light or heavy attacks until they fall over. So while ranged combat is de-emphasized, the melee combat that is slightly more emphasized is very simplistic and unsatisfying. So you start looking at the ranged combat, and you have a selection of ranged weapons that consist of things like bows and arrows, as well as various firearms that would be appropriate for 1960s alternate history Britain. So you're dealing with stuff like Lee Enfield rifles, Sten submachine guns, Browning high powers, Webley revolvers, the L1, which is the British version of the FAL, and interestingly enough, they actually also included the EM2 rifle, which was never actually fielded by Britain. It was technically adopted, but never actually put into full production. But of course, with the alternate history setting, maybe in that particular version of history, they did actually put it into production, so it's kind of neat to see something like that. And then of course, you got your classic single and double-barreled shotguns, as well as, weirdly enough, single-shot 22 LR rifles. Now, logically, I know that the single-shot 22 was put into the game because they needed something to be at the very, very low end of the rifle category. But due to the way it is depicted in the game, I legitimately burst out laughing the first time I saw its animations and effect on target. Because the in-game stats for it say low damage, high accuracy. I guess that makes sense. 22 LR is definitely a low damage round. It is one of the weaker rounds you can possibly get. I mean, hell, you can pretty easily get pellet guns that are more powerful than 22 LR. But as for the high accuracy part, I mean, yeah, that makes sense. It's a very good round for target shooting, not just because it's very low recoil and very cheap, so you're not going to break the bank using it. But generally speaking, 22 LR guns are pretty accurate as long as you're using them within the effective range. But then you actually go to use the rifle in Atomfall, and you find that the recoil is dramatic. I mean, we're talking recoil that looks more along the lines of what you might expect from, say, a 308, which has some pretty stout recoil compared to 22 LR, which has basically none. And on top of that, it's an instant kill headshot, which makes sense from a game mechanic standpoint, but when you consider what 22 LR actually does, and how it is a rather ineffective round for pretty much anything larger than a squirrel, it's legitimately just so ridiculous you can't help but laugh at it. I understand the gameplay implication. It's a single-shot, slow-to-fire rifle. Obviously, it needs to have something to compensate for that, and typically, with low-capacity, slow-firing weapons, the way you compensate for that is to give them much higher damage and accuracy. Thing is, you can't really pull that kind of thing off with 22 LR, so the best they can really do is compensate for it by making all headshots with any of the firearms or even the bow an instant kill. Well, depending on which enemy you're fighting, because there are some enemies that are simply damage sponges or basically immune to gunfire and you have to take them down with other means. Regardless, the presence of the 22 rifle in this is both hilarious and also exposes a fatal flaw in the combat of this game, which is that, as I mentioned, any headshot with any ranged weapon, unless the enemy is either immune to headshots or immune to gunfire, or is not a human, for example, will just drop instantly with a headshot regardless of what you're using. So whether you're using a pistol, a shotgun, a submachine gun, a rifle, it doesn't matter, you just hit them once in the head and they drop like a sack of potatoes. And as long as you are capable of ducking in and out of cover to avoid damage, this absolutely trivializes the combat in this game, at least when you're going up against human enemies. When you're going up against the non-human enemies, that's a bit of a different story because they tend to be damage sponges and just end up being really unsatisfying to fight. But the human enemies are just a total pushover. That said, if they do hit you, they tend to do quite a lot of damage, and that's really the only thing that sort of balances the combat difficulty out. It's that you just can't really take a whole lot of damage before you go down. And that is of course compounded by the relative scarcity of healing items. So even though combat is basically trivialized in this game because of how it actually works out, you're still probably going to try to avoid combat as much as you can anyway, just so you don't waste the ammo and just so you don't waste your valuable healing items if you happen to have any of them on you at all. This pushes you into the stealth system, which is about as bland and generic as it could possibly get. It's basically, are you crouched? Congratulations, you are now in stealth mode. You can hide in tall grass that is conveniently located around the areas that will make you basically invisible to any enemies that are passing by. But if for whatever reason there is no conveniently placed grass patches around, then just stay out of enemies' lines of sight. It is so simplistic that while it is a functional system in the game, it's just not remotely satisfying to engage with. And neither the combat nor the stealth are helped by the fact that the AI in this game is just flat out dumb. Enemies often just bumble their way directly into your shots or your swings with your melee weapons. They will just charge directly at you instead of using cover. The ones that do actually use cover don't use it very effectively. They rarely do things like throw grenades at you to try to flush you out of areas or anything of the sort. And the only thing that even makes them slightly dangerous to you is the fact that they just do a lot of damage to you and you have limited health and limited capacity to heal. And then once you get past combat and stealth, there's not really a whole lot else going on in this game. I mean, you have a sort of investigation angle to it where you'll collect clues as you wander around and find notes and discover things and such. But while that could be interesting, it would require that the writing is more than merely passable at absolute best. There's just not really anything all that interesting about the characters you're running into, the player character themselves, or the environments you're exploring and learning more about, or especially the main story, which frankly you could be easily forgiven for not really knowing the game has a story, because it does pretty much everything in its power to make it look like it doesn't have one. When you start the game, it does give you a bit of world building for the environment you're going to be exploring, the site of this weird disaster that you're uncovering more info about, but that's basically it. You're just dropped in, you have no idea who you are or why you're there, and the game's just like, okay, just go do stuff, I guess. Now, look, I get it. The developers are used to making the Sniper Elite games, and that's pretty much all they've made for quite a long time at this point. It's fairly understandable that because they're used to games that really don't need a whole lot of story, they just need you to have some setup to then go and mess around with the sandbox of the level design a bit, that they wouldn't really understand how important writing is in a game that is more heavily focused on investigation like Atomfall is. You need something to grip the player, to keep their interest going throughout the entire mystery, and Atomfall simply does not have that. It just has nothing to really grab the player's interest and hold on to it in terms of mystery, and the only objective you're given at the start of the game is basically just get out of the exclusion zone. Well, okay, that's a goal, but other than that, you've basically just said, well, the player character has amnesia, and a scientist told them that they need to get out of the zone and gave them a keycard that'll help them do that. Unfortunately, that's just a really flimsy way of trying to grab and hold on to the player's attention. So for an awful lot of the potential audience, you're not really going to have much of a reason to be investigating stuff. You're doing it obviously because that's basically all you can do in this game, but you're not really invested in it. You don't care much about the setting at all. You don't care about who your player character is. You don't care about really why you need to escape or how you're going to escape the exclusion zone. You're just wandering around fairly aimlessly for the most part. That's even after you've managed to find a bunch of leads to go off of, because the game is rather stingy with any kind of precise information, so it gives you vague directions of going to some place, but very little about that place is actually conveyed to you until you're actually there, including how to get to that location, so you just end up, again, wandering around pretty aimlessly until you eventually just stumble upon something. Now, obviously, this isn't going to be the case if you have prior knowledge, if you've already played through the game and just know where everything is, or if you have some sort of guide or wiki available to pull information from so you know what you're going off of. But that's clearly not how the game is intended to be played. The game is intended to be played with you uncovering all of this information and exploring the world yourself. And that aspect of the game is emphasized enough that instead of it being a so-called action survival game, it would be more accurate to say that it's primarily an investigation game with all this other stuff tacked onto it rather awkwardly. But that's not how the game advertises itself. It advertises itself as an action survival game. Which, I mean, half of that, the action part, is somewhat true. The survival part definitely isn't. The only aspect of gameplay that even remotely fits the survival part of it is the crafting system and the limited inventory space you have to work with, neither of which are features specific to survival games. I mean, pretty much every game these days has some sort of crafting system, and limited inventory space is something that's been in a wide variety of games over the years. And since you never need to worry about eating enough food, drinking enough water, or getting enough sleep, I don't really know where they're getting the survival idea from. And if they're trying to say that limited inventory space, a crafting system, and a high amount of damage that enemies do to you is somehow indicative of it being a survival game, well, then they clearly have no idea what survival games actually are. The whole thing just comes across as a really confused mess. Like, the developers wanted to make a whole bunch of different games, but they couldn't really agree on going any one particular direction, so they just threw it all into a blender, and this is the result. No individual component of this game actually stands out as the main reason someone might be interested in playing it. Nothing it does is done well enough to hold on to the player's interest long enough for them to be able to finish it. But at the same time, no particular aspect of it is so bad on its own that it becomes a deal breaker. You end up with a sort of death by 1,000 cuts situation where all of its mediocre components just feed into one another to produce something that isn't really worth playing. And that's a real shame, because it's great to see a developer like Rebellion actually drifting away from their comfort zone, moving away from the tried and true Sniper Elite series and actually trying to make not only a different type of game, but a brand new IP to boot. The problem is that every single piece of media, not just video games, but video games as well, needs a very strong core identity that audiences can latch onto and understand what it's doing, why it's doing what it's doing, and how all of its pieces can fit together to produce an experience that is worth having. And unfortunately, Atomfall simply fails at this. It just doesn't have a very strong core identity that players can latch onto. That's not to say that you can't have fun playing this game. I'm sure there are people out there who do enjoy it, but I really can't figure out who the core audience for this game actually is. If you look at each individual component, none of them are strong enough to recommend it to audiences that are big into those particular components. When you bring it all together, it's such a confused mess that it doesn't really seem to have a core audience of any real description. So, unfortunately, the only thing I really can do with Atomfall, at least in its current state, is just not recommend it to anybody. But while I can't really recommend this game to anybody, I do hope that Rebellion Developments does keep trying things outside of their comfort zone, that they try new IPs, that maybe they expand upon the ideas from Atomfall and actually make it a much more focused, tightly designed experience instead of this strange grab bag that they've thrown together with this one. And it'd also be great to see them branch out into some of the other IPs they've basically just been sitting on for years and years. I mean, they made Evil Genius 2 a few years ago, and that was nice to see, but they also own stuff like Empire Earth, Ground Control, Lords of the Realm, and Lords of Magic, and even the venerable Battle Zone. So there's all kinds of cool stuff they could branch out into if they wanted to get away from just doing Sniper Elite. But whatever the case, they definitely need to learn a few lessons from what went wrong with Atomfall. Namely, they need to make sure the core gameplay experience is not only clearly communicated to the player, but is also tightly designed so that it will grab their attention and hold on to it the entire time, and whoever's doing their marketing needs to clearly communicate to the audience what kind of game it actually is. But as for whether they learned some lessons or not, well, we'll just have to wait and see on that. Thank you all very much for watching. If you like my videos, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that's fine, I understand. But the option's there if you're interested, and every bit really helps out. You'd be amazed how even $1 a month can help out. Thank you all again for watching, and I'll see you all in later videos.